Hello, chainmailers out there. My name is Josh, and I am the kind of creator of this Flor de la Cantuta weave, which is a stabilized version of the Brejão Flowers, or is kind of in the family of Moorish Rose. Most people that are familiar with this set of weaves would know Moorish Rose most of all. But Flor de la Cantuta is a slightly different version that uses 4-ring mobius units instead of 6 in the Moorish Rose. And I'm going to kind of walk through some ideas, some concepts that are relevant to understanding this family of weaves that I think may help you weave them a little bit more easily. I want to stress that this is not explicitly a tutorial. I will be talking mostly about some of the concepts that will help hopefully make those tutorials easier to understand so that you can follow them a little bit better. I may come back around and do a tutorial video at some other point, and I will be doing a short demonstration at the end of this video of a small patch to try to help people get started. But it's not really a tutorial if that's what you're looking for. In the video today, I'm going to talk kind of about 5-ish concepts, and if I get everything set up properly, there's going to be chapters that you can kind of click on specific things if you're curious about them in particular. First of all, specifically for the Flor de la Cantuta weave is the two concepts called warp and weft from actual weaving, like non-chainmail weaving, that I think are useful and helpful in understanding the directionality of rings and where you can put rings. Secondly is that all this family of weaves, Flor de la Cantuta and Moorish Rose, the units have a handedness to them, or a chirality. I love that word. And what that means for how you construct the weave. Effectively getting into left-handed versus right-handed leans, things like that. I want to talk briefly about how the individual rings in one of these mobius units do not have a specific location until you start to weave the rest of the rings around them. That's a strange thing to say, and I'll explain it a little bit more deeply in a second. I'm also going to talk briefly about how you hold your pliers and how you open the rings, and the impact that that has on whether a weave is difficult or easy to figure out how to construct. And also, finally, we're going to end with that little demonstration about how Flor de la Cantuta needs roughly 2 rows of rings before it will feel stable. And then you can build from there much more easily. And so we'll try to show that in the end. So first up, warp and weft. What you can see here with the sample piece is, since this is a square grid, all of the mobius units form a square, and you can see them most obviously here on the diagonal. Like this little orange one is a mobius unit, then that white one, a black one, a white one, etc. There are horizontal rings and there are vertical rings, and so from the perspective I'm showing this right now, the warp ones are the ones that are vertical, and the weft ones are the ones that run horizontal. This is important at different points in here, because on this diagonal all of those colors are the same, but if I take this mobius unit, for example, you can see that the warp rings are orange and the weft rings are white. So this, first off, just I think is a helpful way of thinking about it. You could use terms like vertical and horizontal if that's easier, especially since if you're not too familiar with weaving, then warp and weft are kind of alien terms in general. I don't know, I like them a little bit better. I think it is nice for this. With a piece like this one, the warp and the weft configuration are identical. Like they follow the same color pattern. You've got light blue, orange, white, black going up this way, and from this side you've got light blue, orange, white, black. So they're identical, which creates this nice kind of diagonal symmetry right down it. So if I were to flip it backwards, it looks basically the same. The difference in Flor de la Cantuta has these stabilizing rings, these kind of black ones here that you can see on the back side of the weave. So it will look a little bit different just because there's more rings there, but the pattern is identical if I mirror it kind of on the diagonal. That is a relevant concept if you want to do some other pieces where they are not identical. So this one, for example, has a symmetry kind of mirrored over the midpoint here. So if I flip it this way rather than over the diagonal, it'll look the same. But if I flip it on the diagonal, suddenly that cross changes position because the symmetry is not the same. The reason for that is that the warp rings and the weft rings have a different sequence. Here, the warp coming from this corner, you've got green, black, white, black. But coming from this way down, it's green, 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 green. So they're all different. And then even more relevant, eventually, is a piece like this one, where not only are the warp and the weft different, but the symmetry is also offset from the middle. So right here, this is not the dead middle, this is actually offset by 1. The middle's up here. So even when I flip it over, like right down the middle, now the red one has this sort of weft red line has moved up. So it is actually important to understand what your warp and weft rings are and where they are, because when you're weaving it, you want to make sure that the front side looks the way you want it to, and that you have to reverse some things on the back side if you're doing that. Bigger concepts for a different video, but I just kind of wanted to briefly kind of talk about the idea of the warp and weft. Next up is talking a little bit about the chirality, or the handedness. So in this piece, you can see, generally speaking, the bottoms of the rings, like this orange one here, is on the right-hand side, and the top of the ring is on the left-hand side. So I would say that this has a left-handed lean. However, this piece that I'm working on here, this is actually based on the approach that Brigitte Giebels makes. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, so feel free to correct me. And if you look at this yellow one, because it's a little bit easier to see, the bottom of the ring is on the left and the top of the ring is on the right. So these Mobius units have a right-handed lean. That's a particularly important thing for you to wrap your head around when you're starting on a tutorial, is making sure that you get the lean right, because otherwise you might have some strong difficulty. And it is easy to accidentally switch your leans in the middle of weaving. So you might find that you have a problem because you set up one of the units going one way and a different unit going the other way. So you really have to be diligent about being consistent throughout the weave. Otherwise, you're going to run into problems. You won't be able to construct it properly. Related to that, I kind of explained a second ago that individual rings in a Mobius unit don't have a specific location. That's a very hard thing for me to show. I'll show that a little bit more detail when I kind of do the example a little later on, where I'm making a small patch, and it'll be more obvious to see, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to weave a single strand of weft rings. I'm going to weave some warp rings into them, and I'll show how, depending on how you hold it, those warp rings can either go above or below the weft rings. It'll make more sense. Finally, before I get into the demonstration, is how you hold your pliers and how you open your rings can actually make a difference. So I don't know whether I am just in a minority among the chainmail community or not, but I believe that I hold my pliers in kind of a strange way. Your selection of pliers and how you hold them makes all the difference in the world. That's why we love talking about what kind of pliers we have and all that stuff. So let me show you. This is basically how I do it. I use a pair of flat nose in my right hand and a bent nose here in my left. The bent nose ones come out, let's say the side of my hand, where the flat ones come out by my fingertips. So my grip is kind of like this almost all the time. I almost never do what I see most people, where they've kind of holding both of them in the same orientation. This feels really weird to me just because I don't have the practice with it. I've been doing this for years. The other piece is how you open your rings. Let me take this yellow one. That'll be a little bit more visible on the screen here. So naturally, the rings themselves also have a handedness. So if we take a look at this one, right, before I do anything to it, you can see that on the left-hand side, the ring is on top, and the right-hand side, the ring is on the bottom. That's where the cut is, the spiral of the ring before they were cut. When I open them, I always open the other way around. So I want the side that is farthest from my right hand to be below the ring. And I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I find that makes a big difference in how I weave. If I had opened it the other way around, my hand has to move in a different way. But I find that this works a little bit better, and for some reason I feel like I can hook certain parts of the weave a lot more easily this way. So just things to think about in how you do it yourself. How do you hold your pliers? How do you open your rings? Maybe switch it up sometime. If you're having difficulty with a weave, try a different approach and you might find that it works a little bit more easily. All right, and now I want to get into a little demonstration to talk a little bit about the stability of Flor de la Cantuta, as well as getting it to a point where you can carry the weave on. So talking in general about some of the major pieces of its construction, so you can try to break it down a little bit better in your mind. First thing to draw your attention to is a couple of construction principles. So for one, when I am making the weave, I will kind of edge my piece a little. So I'll take a look at the other side here without the stabilizing rings. And so every ring on an outside edge will be missing whatever the loose ring would be in that direction. So you can see this mobius here, there's only 3 rings on. This one, also only 3 rings. Since the corners are on 2 sides, they're going to be missing 2 pieces. So you've only got 2 rings in this mobius unit here on the corner. That's important to remember when we start kind of sketching out the pieces here in a second. About the stability, you can see here is a unit or a chunk of a weave that is 3 rows wide. And this also highlights what I was talking about with the edge as well. So you've got the loose rings down here. I just want to remove them to have a nice clean edge. So this one doesn't have those same loose ones on the top. Now, I'm talking a bit about the stability. You see I've got 3 rows of units. So there's a full 4 ring unit there, a full 4, and then a 3 on top. So this is 3 rows, and this is nice and stable. Because of the nature of the weave, it might have just a very gentle twist to it at this point, but it stays pretty well flat. And you don't have to worry about any difficulty finding where rings ought to go from that point on. I think most people, if they got it to this point, you're good. The one above it, though, is only about half as done as the other one. So it has the full top row, the same top row as this one, and a set of the stabilizing rings that you can see here as flat red rings on the back. It looks fine now as it is on the plate here, but if I pick it up, it's going to look like a jumble of rings that's kind of generally a mess, because at this point it's still not particularly stable. With a bit of massaging, you can get it to lay nicely like this so you can see the pattern, but it's maybe a little unintuitive until you have some practice with it. Just before I pick it up though, you can see that it is an identical weave, right? So all of these warp rings that I was referring to earlier have the same color pattern, so you can see exactly what it is, lined up with the one below it. Now I'm going to pick it up. I'm going to kind of be careful to try to maintain these last rings on the end because they're a little bit fidgetier than the rest of it. And when I lay it on my hand, well, that looks like a mess. So what happened is the weave itself has kind of a natural twist to it, which is much more pronounced in the first row and a half. As you start adding rings to the second row, that twist starts to go away. You'll still have to fight it even a ring or 2 beyond this, but this is kind of a mess. Knowing that I have secured my left side here, I can get pretty close to how it ought to look just by twisting the other end. And gradually as I twist it, you can see that nice little structure come back. I can lay it down again. Now even here, it's not perfect laying down. Like I untwisted it, but you can see there's still a little bit of confusion. Like this black ring, for example, isn't quite seated the same way as the other ones. So it kind of flipped over. I'm just going to nudge it back. And then it looks a little bit better. And then this side also is a little bit chaotic. This ring isn't lined up kind of like the rest of these ones. So you kind of flip that back. And you have to massage the ones that are on the end a lot more. Because they aren't anchored into as many rings, but there you go. It's kind of roughly back to the shape it ought to be. All right, at this point, I'm going to try to show you a small version of this woven live, and I want to emphasize 2 things. One, I have an autofocus camera, so while I'm doing work, it may kind of cut in and out of focus. Not the best as far as trying to understand what I'm doing. And two, again, this is not a tutorial. I'm trying to talk about some of the principles and the concepts behind it. You might be able to get enough information from this to start doing the weave yourself, but I highly recommend checking out like an actual tutorial that'll be much more stepwise and can probably help you figure it out a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a 5-unit wide, 2-row wide, just to get it to the point where the weave is relatively stable. I'm going to use 3 colors. The white is going to be my weft rings. The red is going to be my warp rings, and then black is going to be my stabilizing rings. This will help to show you kind of the verticality of the different pieces of the unit, and gives us at least a little bit of a frame of reference so you know what rings are going into what rings. To start with, I need, in order to make a 5-unit thing, I need 8 rings in a chain, just a simple chain. I'm going to pre-close some of my rings, and I may pre-close a few rings later as well, just because I'm used to it. If you are using a tutorial, there probably won't be any pre-closed rings, and you might just want to play around with it yourself to figure out whether or not any rings make sense to close ahead of time. I don't know that it actually adds any speed to the weave, but to me it just kind of helps being like, oh, this is a free ring that I can add in and I don't really have to think about too much. I'm not sure if I'm going to actually do that just yet. Okay, so I've got 7 rings in that chain now. And here's the 8th. So these are my weft rings. The first thing I want to do before I go any further is just think for a moment to myself what these have to look like. The 2 rings on the end are going to be the only units, the only rings as part of the weft on the exterior of the piece. So using this again to illustrate, if I have this white ring is a weft ring, notice there is no second white ring out here. So this white ring is the equivalent to this white ring there. And likewise on the other side. If I am looking for my personal preference, a left-handedness, right now I can tell you that this is set up for a right-handed lean. And so I'm going to flip every other ring over, just so I've got that mental picture. How do I know that? Well, first off, I'm going to pick everything up again and try to get it here closer. So I know that this first ring I don't really care about. I'm ignoring that because it's all by itself on the end. Everything so it's all facing the same direction. So the next 2 rings are the ones that are forming my first Mobius unit. If I hide everything else except those 2 rings, I can decide or determine what the lean of this Mobius unit is going to be. So what I know right now is that this is a right-handed lean. If I hold it this way, it's a little more obvious, I think, because you can see that on the bottom ring, this side is lower and this side is higher. So it'll have this kind of right-handed twist. So I want it to be the other way around. So if that's the case, then I want to make sure that everything else lies in that same pattern. So this is generally how I have to have it laid out if I want the lean. Obviously, as soon as I pick it up, all of that goes out the window, so I'm not too worried about keeping it like this right now. I just remember this is my reference point. I always want the right ring of the Mobius unit facing toward me and the left ring of the Mobius unit facing away from me. And with that, I'm going to add 5 warp rings. The first 2 are easy. They just go on the end. They don't have anything special about them. You just stick them on the end of the chain. I'll get them out of the way nice and quick. And then it's the next 3 that we're concerned about. So once again, I want the right ring facing toward me and the left ring facing away. You ignore the first white ring because that's the unit on the end. And then the next 2, the right one faces you and the left one faces away. Then I'm going to put a warp ring through the eye that those 2 rings form. So I can space them out just a little bit to make my life easier. Hold it in place, and then go through the eye. Now here is where I want to return to talking about the positioning of the rings, that they aren't set yet until you give them a place to be. So once again, if we can get that focus. There we go. So there's my current Mobius unit. It's got three rings in it. This red one doesn't yet have a home. So if I can move it, you can also see that I wove it through an eye a second ago, and it is now currently around an eye. That's not the same as it was. But if I kind of squish things around just a little bit, we'll get that through there. Without letting go of either end, now that red ring is through the eye again. And it's coming out the bottom. If I squeeze it a little bit, it's popped back there in the center. And then I can go the other way, and it's through the eye coming out the top. Now, I didn't let go of this chain at all. There's no magic tricks involved. It's just the fact that the way that this is constructed is that the center is kind of fluid. So this red ring doesn't have a specific home to be yet until I weave another ring into it. That'll be particularly useful because, at least in my opinion, it kind of makes things like Moorish Rose and Flor de la Cantuta a little bit more fluid and flexible, a little more forgiving, because you don't necessarily need to get the right ring, you just need to get one of the right rings. It's a weird concept. There's actually an article on the Mail Artisan's website about Moorish Rose that explains it a little better than I do. But I found once I understood that, it made the weaves make a little bit more sense. It made it easier to figure out what was supposed to go where. If you're doing kind of advanced patterns where specific rings have to be specific colors, then it matters a lot more. But if you're just doing like an all silver thing, then it doesn't matter as much because the rings can kind of, not all of them, but some of the rings can go wherever you need them when you need them. That's a little bit of a simplification. Okay. So I'm going to lay it out here. I've got them all here. We got our warp rings in place. Now I want to go ahead and add stabilizing rings, so we can move on to row 2. The stabilizing rings, I need 4. Trying to see around my microphone here. And how this works is we'll start at the end. You got the rightmost warp ring here, and basically just kind of having it hanging. You see I've got my Mobius unit set up the same way as it was before, with the right one toward me, the left one far away. And I'm going to go through that rightmost warp ring, the red ring, from the outside in, basically. And then bring this black ring up, and from the top down, in through the weft ring, the right weft ring of this next unit. Okay. And in order to try to maintain this stability, I know that all of this stuff is where it needs to be. So I'm going to kind of get it back on my hand like that and drag it just a little bit. The twist that the weave has gets worse and worse and worse the longer it goes away. But if it's pretty close to your hand and you know that this stuff that's right on top is correct, then the next rings immediately following it are going to be pretty close to correct, and you don't have to worry too much about it. So I do a lot of this where I grab a hold of the weave on my fingers. And then I'm going to kind of do the same thing. So this is coming in from the top of the red ring, clicking under it, and going through the top of the rightmost weave of the rightmost ring of the next Mobius unit over. And close. And do the same thing 2 more times. Down through the top of the red ring, down through the top of the rightmost on the next one. And then 1 more time. Down through the top, down through the top. Okay. I'm gonna lay this out so you can see that everything's pretty much where it should be. Now this last warp ring is an orphan at the moment. It's going to get picked up in the next step, so don't worry. And this is also now at the point where the one that we had earlier is, right? So same stage, right? We've got the top row and we've got the next set of rings. See, they still kind of flip over and change on you, so it's still unstable, and this is the most frustrating part for everybody, I think, that's trying to learn it. But there we go. The next set of rings I'm going to do is another set of warp rings on the, we're going to start the second row. So I need another 5 of these red rings. And the rule of thumb for this is that on the second row, all of the warp rings have to connect to each other. So this ring is going to connect into the warp ring in the row above it, and it is also going to go through the one of the stabilizing rings. Since I work right to left, there's actually no stabilizing ring on the outside that I need for this step, so this first ring is only going to go through the outer warp ring, and that's it. It's going to hang free. And again, you can kind of see like I'm still trying to wrestle with it a little bit myself until I get it back in the orientation I need it to be. Okay, now here's where you actually go through 2 rings. So I've got my stabilizing ring. I'm going to go through the top of that, and then through the top of the warp ring behind it. Get it back positioned correctly in my hand. New warp ring through the top of the stabilizing ring, and through the warp ring behind it. Get it back positioned nicely in my hand. Warp ring goes through the next stabilizing ring, and the top of the warp ring behind it. And you've seen I had to kind of fight each step of the way to get things oriented the right way, just because of the twist that's going on and things aren't totally stable yet. As you practice, it'll become easier to see what rings have to be where. And finally, top of the stabilizing ring and the warp ring behind it. Okay, at this point, you can kind of see from here that there's still a little bit of a twist, but it's already making a lot more sense than it did a second ago, and it's easier to kind of get it to line up nicely. I don't have to do quite as much fidgeting. Right. It's pretty close, except for this one here on the end. There's always got to be a ring that makes a liar out of you. I think that's one of the rules of chainmail. There we go. Took a while. Again, it helps as you do the weave, you get more familiar with what rings look like they're out of place and what ones look like they're in place. The ones that are on the edge are the most likely to give you problems because they have the fewest points of connection. Once a ring is connected into 3 other rings, it's pretty well set. It's not really going to flip around too much. But if it's only got 2 points of connection, you know, it can kind of change its orientation pretty easily on those 2 points. The next rings that I add are pretty much going to seal the deal as far as the stability of the weave, and those are going to be 4 weft rings. These are the last rings that go through the stabilizing ring. So what you can see is like this black one here. There are 2 rings from the previous row and 1 ring from this new row that go through it. And then the rings that I'm about to add will fit into that kind of last corner there, and they'll start to connect this row together. I'm going to refer back to my sheet here because this is a little bit different than how I usually do it, and I want to make sure that I'm looking at it correctly. So what we have done is we've gone through, so here's our reference stable ring. Let me see if I can get a good focus on it for you. Okay, so here's a good one right there. And we have gone through the kind of top right and then both of the left ones. We've got them in place. So we're doing this one here that's going sideways, and it will have to connect into the warp ring to the side as well as to the stabilizing ring on its own. So what that looks like is you'll come kind of up from the back side of the warp ring, kind of go over the edge and down through the top of the stabilizing ring. So this is kind of like going around an eye if you were doing a half Persian weave. We're going to do that 4 times. So again, you come up from the back side of the red one and down through the top side of the black one. Up from the back side of the red and down through the top side of the black. Up from the back of the red, down through the top of the black. And this pretty much has it stable. For one last ring that'll really seal the deal no matter what, and then you won't have to worry too much anymore. We're going to do the other 4 weft rings. So these ones have to now connect the white rings that are in here. This ring here on the end is the only weft ring of this Mobius unit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through that one, not through the whole Mobius unit. But then these 2 rings are forming the next Mobius unit. I'm going to come up through the eye that forms that unit. So we'll go through both of them. And we do that 4 times as well. Same idea. So through the ring on the previous unit and through the eye of the new unit. And none of these rings that I'm putting in now go through the stabilizing ring above. This is all part of the next row. Through the 1, up through the 2 of the new unit. And you need 1 more on the end. Through the 1 and up through. All right. So that's now basically 2 rows, right? There's no loose rings on either side, but each Mobius unit, here, I'll show you a little closer. So every Mobius unit in this piece now has 3 rings. So this one, for example, has 2 white and a red, and you've got 2 white and a red, 2 white and a red, except for the ones on the edges, which will only have 2. This is now stable, and you can go. You don't have to worry about it falling apart on you or twisting too much. You can add the next row and carry on from there based on whatever tutorial you're looking at. But this is like your primary goal, is to get it, about 2 rows in. And once you're at that point, then all of the other steps are there. They come easy. You don't have to worry too much. So check out some of those tutorials. I hope this was generally helpful in further understanding a little bit more about this weave and the family of weaves, with Moorish Rose included. And I might try my best at making an actual video tutorial at some point, but no promises, because I don't think that I can explain it as well as some of the folks that are doing those step-by-step tutorials actually do. Anyway, thanks for watching, and good luck.